Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a truly fascinating linguistic mystery, Surah 9, At-Tawbah. We're going to set aside traditional interpretations for a moment and look directly at the original Arabic to see exactly what the text actually says on its own terms.
Okay, so you might already be familiar with this specific chapter, as it's pretty infamous. It's frequently labeled as the absolute most controversial, violent chapter in the entire Quran. It's constantly cited as some sort of charter for perpetual warfare. But as you'll see, the source's linguistic analysis reveals something entirely different. It points to a highly specific, legally bounded settlement.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at why it's the most controversial chapter. Second, the context of broken treaties. Third, we're decoding the sword verse. Fourth, reevaluating taxes and authority. And finally, charity, knowledge, and repentance. Let's get right into it. Section 1, the most controversial chapter. We're looking at the missing Bismillah and the massive weight of this text. 0. That is literally the number of times the customary opening of mercy, the Bismillah, appears at the start of Surah 9. It's actually the only chapter in the entire book with this omission. Now, tradition often interprets this 0 as a sign of absolute divine wrath, basically setting a really severe, unforgiving tone for everything that follows. But hold on. Just look at the very first verse. The literal Arabic doesn't actually announce a universal religious war. Instead, it announces a highly specific severance of covenants. It's a formal dissolution of treaties with a very clearly defined group of violators. Moving to Section 2, context of broken treaties. Let's identify the true target of this disavowal. To really understand what's happening here, we need to treat the Arabic root words almost like puzzle pieces. The chapter opens with Bara'ah. This literally means to physically cut away from or to disavowal. So in this specific context, we're talking about a political and diplomatic severance from treaties that had already been violated by the opposing side. The source identifies that the group being targeted here, the mushrikeen, well, they aren't being addressed as some abstract religious category, not at all. They are defined purely by their actions. We're talking about breaking oaths, violating active peace treaties, attacking the way of life, and actively attempting to expel the messenger. And this brings us to a really crucial built-in legal boundary. Right there in verse 4, the text creates an explicit exception. It legally protects any opposing groups that had actually honored their peace agreements, straight up commanding followers to fulfill their covenants with them. So the whole declaration is entirely conditional on behavior. Furthermore, this dissolution isn't just immediate chaos. It actually provides the treaty breakers a strict 4-month grace period, starting from the public proclamation. It literally gives them a full season to travel the land and figure out their political path before any fighting is even permitted. Which brings us to Section 3, decoding the infamous sword verse. We're analyzing verse 9.5 in its full context. Okay, verse 9.5. If you read it in total isolation, fight the mushrikeen wherever you find them, definitely sounds like an open-ended command. But the source points out the explicit conditional clauses embedded right alongside it. Then when the sacred months have passed. And crucially, but if they turn back, then release their way. This linguistic investigation reveals a massive contrast. Tradition often interprets this verse as a command to fight polytheists until they convert. But the actual Arabic text dictates fighting active treaty breakers only until they cease their aggression. The conflict is strictly bounded by a very specific exit condition. And that exit condition hinges entirely on the word tawbah. When you trace it through the rest of the text, tawbah does not mean forced religious conversion. It literally means turning back or returning to a previous state. It's turning away from hostility back to a state of proper, peaceful relationship. So put it all together and we get this really clear step-by-step framework directly from the text. First, observe the grace period. Second, engage only the active treaty breakers. And third, release them immediately if they initiate tawbah. The conflict is fundamentally conditional and proportional. And hey, if there was any lingering doubt, the very next verse, 9.6, completely upends that perpetual war myth. It strictly mandates granting asylum to anyone from the opposing side who requests it, and it requires providing a safe escort to their place of safety. This applies even if they completely reject the spiritual message. Section 4, reevaluating taxes and authority. Let's look at the jizya verse and the text's critiques of corruption. Right at the center of this section is the term jizya.
The linguistic root here, JZY, actually means compensation or repayment. The source emphasizes that this verse explicitly targets a hostile subset of the people of the book who were engaged in active conflict. We're talking about those who had specifically rejected peace.
The source really contrasts the traditional view of an eternal religious tax with the actual contextual meaning. The verse describes these hostile actors as sajurun, which means a state of defeat and conflict. Therefore, this is acting as a practical war settlement clause, where defeated aggressors pay compensation from their own capacity, not some charter for religious apartheid.
Now, interestingly enough, immediately following this, the surah shifts to a universal critique of religious hypocrisy. It warns against corrupt scholars and clergy who use religion to consume people's wealth and create unquestionable power hierarchies. It's placing direct accountability firmly above clerical authority.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, Charity, Knowledge, and Repentance, uncovering the true meaning of At-Tawbah.
In stark contrast to a charter of war, the text ultimately lays down a really definitive, structured legal framework for social equity. Verse 60 outlines exactly how wealth, or zakat, must be distributed. It focuses entirely on circulating resources to the vulnerable. We're talking about the poor, the needy, and those trapped in debt.
Through analyzing the story of the Tabuk expedition, which was a notoriously difficult military campaign where some followers faltered and stayed behind, the text reveals its core thesis. The surah is named the turning back because divine mercy turns first toward those who falter, allowing them the space for sincere repentance.
So, we'll leave you with this final, rather provocative thought. If investigating the root words of the most famously controversial chapter reveals a framework of bounded defense, social welfare, and mercy, well, how might returning directly to the source material change our entire understanding of history? Thank you for joining us for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning what you read.